Now let's take a look at race relations back on the home front in the United States during World War II. And as you might suspect, it was not a pretty picture. And it really wasn't just the black and white binary situation, but it was kind of across the board. In fact, first we're going to look at some anti-Latino violence in 1943 in Los Angeles, what became known as the Zoot Riot. Now, as you'll recall from an earlier lecture, zoot suits were sort of these large, broad-shouldered, very baggy suits, often worn with a wide-brimmed hat, that were sort of the equivalent of kind of the hip-hop apparel of the 1930s and into the 1940s. It was considered very cool, and it was primarily a symbol that, the modern, the modern equivalent would be talking about people emulating hip-hop stars, older people saying that they look like thugs. As you'll recall, the Joker in Batman wore one of these suits so that you could immediately realize he's from the wrong side of the tracks. And young Latino men, and to a lesser degree, young African-American men, maybe not even to a lesser degree. So let's just say young Latino men, young African-American men, favored, oftentimes, many of them, favored this look. It was in style. Cab Calloway, who was a very famous jazz performer at the time, African-American, wore such a suit. In 1943, in Los Angeles, there was a widespread race riot. And remember, when we're talking about before the 1960s, race riots were always large groups of angry white people attacking some minority. Many of the rioters on this occasion were U.S. servicemen. Most of them sailors, but also soldiers and people from the other branches. Mostly sailors, because several ships were docked in Los Angeles, and these sailors were on leave, either getting ready to go out to the war in the Pacific or just back from war in the Pacific. And, an incident that started in initially in a nightclub between some young Latino men and some sailors just kind of burst and spilled over into the whole city and became extremely violent. Now, what does this have to do with zoot suits? Well, part of it is because the young Latino men were primarily targeted by the angry mobs, many of whom, like I said, were military. But why is that? Strange as it sounds, it had a lot to do with men's fashion, as well as with conservation connected to the war. Here I've got some old pictures of guys in suits. The guy in the very middle, the drawing, as well as the two guys on the left, those are representative of what men's suits looked like in the 1930s. Into the very early 1940s. The picture on the far right shows a guy in a suit from the mid to late 1940s. Now you'll notice the older style they were very loose-fitting and kind of baggy. They had really kind of large legs on the pants, and they had very broad shoulders. You'll notice they had really wide lapels. They also had fairly wide neckties. Styles, though, changed after the war started, and maybe you've noticed that, you probably haven't, but now if you think back, or if you're watching old movies after this and you know what date the movie is and you pay attention, you'll see this. The styles changed to be much narrower, not baggy, much more close-fitting, the ties got really skinny, and skinny ties was the thing, actually the style for quite a ways after this. And even the lapels on the suits got much narrower. And there's a reason for that beyond just fashion sense. The broader reason is that, remember, everything's being conserved, everything's being recycled, rubber, paper, and so forth. The same thing was true with cloth, with materials that were used to make clothing. There had to be a lot of cloth used, purposed for making military uniforms, because all these people are in uniform now, and many of them have multiple uniforms, right? Field uniforms, dress uniforms, etc. So it was the patriotic thing to do, in addition to, using your gas rationing and so forth, or recycling your metal. It was the patriotic thing to do not to be making these big baggy suits anymore. And yet, there were these young men who already were sort of looked down on by a lot of middle class people, by a lot of people in the majority, because it was principally minority groups that were wearing this style of clothing, and they were doing it as kind of a statement, kind of an anti-establishment statement, even after styles had changed. They continued to wear these outfits, these very ostentatious outfits, very baggy, kind of openly. And some people used that as an excuse to be angry at the people wearing them, particularly since those people belong to certain groups. The riot lasted for several days, with a lot of people being injured. It finally started to slow down only when the Navy took action and confined their men to their ships and canceled their leave. The city of Los Angeles, however, did take action to prevent something like this from happening in the future. They introduced an act to ban zoot suits. Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady, made a comment about this incident, calling it a racial protest and condemning it essentially as a race riot. And the Los Angeles Times called her a communist and said she was trying to stir up racial protest. Also, of course, life was not easy if you were Japanese American during World War II. As you're no doubt aware, the U.S. government actually rounded up Japanese Americans, and this included immigrants from Japan who had become naturalized citizens of the U.S. in most cases, but also their children who were born in the U.S. and were therefore born American citizens, and in some cases people whose great-grandparents had been immigrants from Japan. Didn't matter if you were of Japanese descent west of the Mississippi, you were rounded up, and I say west of the Mississippi, there weren't very many east of the Mississippi. You were rounded up and placed in these containment camps, often, not often, always, surrounded by barbed wire with armed guards. People were sort of just taken out of their homes, had to leave their homes and most of their belongings behind, had to leave their businesses behind to fail. Their homes frequently were lost because they weren't paying the mortgage or weren't keeping up on the taxes, and they were clustered together in these camps. A man named Fred Korematsu, a Japanese American, challenged this, and it took it to court. He took it to court. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Finally reached the Supreme Court in 1944. The case of Korematsu versus United States, and the Supreme Court said this is perfectly fine because the security of the nation outweighs anything that might be bad about this, which of course, was interesting because they didn't round up all the German Americans or the Italian Americans, only the Japanese Americans. And, well, we all know now that this was a bad thing. People, some people knew then, but you know how things are, or maybe you don't. There's a lot of paranoia. There's a lot of hysteria during time of war, and people don't think clearly, and sometimes they do not suppress things they would have suppressed in peacetime when it comes to their attitudes about other groups of people. Here are some of those people who were considered to be dangerous threats to America and were interned along with their families in those camps during the war. There on the left, you have Pat Morita, most famous for playing Mr. Miyagi in the Karate Kid movies in the 1980s. Also played Arnold in Happy Days in the 70s. On the right, George Takei, Star Trek fame, and more than that, maybe to the younger generation who's not that familiar with Star Trek, just famous for being an online personality. And there on the bottom, Jack Sue, who maybe your parents remember from Barney Miller, which was a TV show in the 70s and 80s, a sitcom in which he played Detective Nick Yamana. Jack Sue, his real name was Goro Suzuki. At the end of World War II, changed his name. He was a little bit older than these other guys who were kids at the time. He was a young man, changed his name from Suzuki to Sue, so people would think he was Chinese, of Chinese descent, instead of Japanese, and he would be able to get work. Oddly enough, young Japanese American men who were confined with their families in these containment camps were still subject to the draft, and many of them were, in fact, drafted. Many others volunteered to serve in the U.S. military to prove their patriotism and to prove that they were loyal Americans. They were segregated. They were put in the 442nd Infantry in the U.S. Army. The regiment's motto was "Go for broke." They served not in the Pacific. They didn't fight against Japanese. They served in the European theater and actually saw a lot of fighting in Italy and then in Western Europe, particularly in Germany during the war. And altogether, 21 individuals from that regiment won the Medal of Honor. So they really did demonstrate their ability and willingness to fight. Just a few years after the war was over, in the early 50s, there was a movie made about the 442nd Infantry. The name of the movie is Go for Broke, and it's pretty good. It has an all Japanese-American cast. The last time I checked, it was up on YouTube, and if you're one of my students, I'll have the link put up for it.